Introduction. I was 22. I'd been on the good end of a bad drug deal. In the wee hours of some morning late in 1985, behind a nameless restaurant in South Florida, a dealer gave me and a friend the wrong bag. I was the winner in this deal with substantially more drug than I was obliged to pass on to a friend of a friend somewhere in the Midwest. Homeless at the time, my compatriot and I ended up checking into a cheap motel in Deerfield Beach. Predictably, we used the surplus along with what we owed. Toward the end of that binge, the stash mercifully depleted, both of us exhausted and on edge. My friend inexplicably announced that there would never be enough cocaine for us, while the prophecy struck me as true even in my overwhelmed state. I also knew it was irrelevant. As with every addict, my days of actually getting high were long past. My using was compulsive and aimed more at escaping reality than at getting off. I'd banged my head against the wall long enough to realize that nothing new was going to happen. Except perhaps through the ultimate escape, death. Which frankly didn't seem like that big a deal. About 6 months later, through a series of circumstances rather than personal insight or strength of character, I was clean and sober for the first time in years, and therefore not quite so numb. I saw that I had a life or death choice. I could continue colluding with my mental illness as it inexorably consumed me, or I could find a different way to live. In my experience, very few faced with those possibilities choose life. And I first went with the majority. The cost of abstinence seemed too high, without drugs. What would there be to live for anyway? However, in a demonstration of tenacity almost diagnostic of an active addict, it dawned on me that I might be able to find another way. After all, I thought, I'd come through many tight situations, bad deals in condemned buildings or police stations, with or without loaded guns, and miles from anything friendly or familiar, aware now for the first time of the medical model of addiction. I figured that my disease was a biological problem that could be solved. I decided to cure addiction so I could somehow eliminate the problems caused by using, with what may seem like exceptional fortitude to some, especially given that I'd been kicked out of 3 schools by this time. I went on to get a PhD in behavioral neuroscience and to become an expert in the neurobiology, chemistry, and genetics of addictive behavior. This accomplishment would seem almost unremarkable to most addicts, who know firsthand that there is nothing we would not do, no sacrifice too great, to be able to use. It ultimately took 7 years to graduate from college, including about a year of dramatic change starting in a treatment center, plus another 7 years of graduate school to earn that degree. This book is a summary of what I have learned over the past 20 or so years as a researcher studying the neuroscience of addiction. Though I've received grants from the National Institutes of Health and possess a controlled substance license from the Drug Enforcement Administration, I regret to say that I haven't solved the problem. I have, however, learned a lot about how people like me differ even before they pick up their first drug and about what addictive substances do to our brains. My hope is that sharing this information might help loved ones, caregivers, and crafters of public policy make more informed choices. Perhaps this understanding may even help the afflicted ones themselves, because it's quite clear to me that the solution isn't coming in a pill. Addiction today is epidemic and catastrophic. If we are not victims ourselves, we all know someone struggling with a merciless compulsion to remodel experience by altering brain function. The personal and social consequences of this widespread and relentless urge are almost too large to grasp. In the United States, about 16% of the population 12 and older meet criteria for a substance use disorder, and about a quarter of all deaths are attributed to excessive drug use. Each day, 10,000 people around the globe die as a result of substance abuse. Along this path to the grave is a breathtaking series of losses of hope, dignity, relationships, money, generativity, family and societal structure, and community resources. Worldwide, addiction may be the most formidable health problem, affecting about 1 in every 5 people over the age of 14. In purely financial terms, it costs more than 5 times as much as AIDS and twice as much as cancer. In the United States, this means that close to 10% of all health care expenditures go toward prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of people suffering from addictive diseases, and the statistics are similarly frightening in most other Western cultures. Despite all this money and effort, successful recovery is no more likely than it was 50 years ago. There are 2 primary reasons for the incredibly broad, deep, and persistent costs of drug addiction. First, excessive use is remarkably common, cutting across geographic, economic, ethnic, and gender lines with little variation. It is also highly resistant to treatment. Although reliable estimates are hard to come by, most experts agree that no more than 10% of substance abusers can manage to stay clean for any appreciable time. As far as illnesses go, this rate is almost singularly low. One has about twice as good a chance of surviving brain cancer. Despite a statistically bleak outlook, there are some reasons to be encouraged. Some addicts, once desperate cases, do get clean and stay clean, and even go on to live productive, happy lives. While neuroscience hasn't been able to thoroughly parse the mechanisms behind this transformation, we have learned quite a lot about the causes of the problem. We know, for instance, that addiction results from a complex web of factors including a genetic predisposition, developmental influences, and environmental input. I say complex because each of these factors is very dense. That is, hundreds of genes and innumerable environmental contributions are involved. The factors also depend on one another. For example, a particular strand of DNA may enhance a liability for addiction but only in the presence of other specific genes and along with certain experiences during development and in specific contexts. So, while we may know a lot, the complexity of the disease means that we are still unable to predict whether a particular individual will develop an addiction. While in the end there might be as many different paths to addiction as there are addicts, there are general principles of brain function that underlie all compulsive use. My aim in writing this book is to share these principles and thus shed light on the biological dead end that perpetuates substance use and abuse, namely, that there will never be enough drug, because the brain's capacity to learn and adapt is basically infinite. What was once a normal state punctuated by periods of high, inexorably transforms to a state of desperation that is only temporarily subdued by drug. Understanding the mechanisms behind every addict's experience makes it very clear that short of death or long-term sobriety there is no way to quell the screaming need between exposures. At the point where pathology determines behavior, most addicts die trying to satisfy an insatiable drive. My story: the first time I got drunk, at 13, I felt as Eve should have after tasting the apple, or as a bird hatched in a cage would feel upon being unexpectedly set free. The drug provided physical relief and spiritual antidote for the persistent restlessness I'd been unable to identify or share. An abrupt shift of perspective coincident with guzzling half a gallon of wine in my friend's basement somehow made me feel sure that both life and I were going to be all right. Just as light is revealed by darkness, and joy by sorrow, alcohol provided powerful subconscious recognition of my desperate strivings for self-acceptance and existential purpose and my inability to negotiate a complex world of relationships, fears, and hopes. At the same time, it seemed to deliver, on a satin pillow, the key to all my blooming angst. Abruptly relieved from an existence both harsh and lackluster, I had finally discovered ease. Or perhaps that ease was more akin to anesthesia. But at the time and for several years after, I not only couldn't tell the difference but didn't care. Until the moment alcohol first filled my belly and brain, I hadn't consciously recognized that I'd been just enduring. But that evening, as I leaned out the open window of my friend's bedroom, gazing at the stars, I took what felt like my first truly deep breaths. A plaque I later saw posted behind a bar described my first experience precisely. Alcohol makes you feel like you're supposed to feel when you're not drinking alcohol. Among other things, I wondered why, if the drug can do this, didn't everyone drink more and more often? So I began with enthusiasm, even determination. From the start, I consumed as much and as often as I could, literally through most of 7th grade, because school afforded the best opportunities for freedom from parental oversight in my suburban, middle-class world. Drinking before, during, and after school, I seemed to possess an admirable innate tolerance. I was almost never sick or hungover. Perhaps it was my youthful liver, and appeared presentable despite what would surely be deemed legal intoxication. Though I never achieved the overwhelming sense of wholeness that I experienced the first time, alcohol continued to confer muted contentment. Any altered state seemed a dramatic improvement over a drab and tedious life towing the line. As far back as I can remember, I felt hemmed in, frustrated by imposed limits and my own limitations. Longing for something else, is at the core of my experience of self. Even today, below the persona of nurturing friend, committed partner, determined scientist, and adoring parent is a heartbreaking desire to embrace oblivion. From what or to where I seek escape, I really can't say. I just know that the constraints of space, time, circumstances, obligations, choices fill me with an overwhelming sense of desperation. In fact, my modal thought is that I'm squandering time, though I am quick to admit that I have no idea what to do with myself. Like in a dream, time flows by as I futilely pursue a series of inane tasks, all the while suppressing a growing sense of panic. I fantasize about disembarking at an unfamiliar exit, or pushing aside a broken gate into a foreign sanctum, somehow entering a world where we all at least agree not to pretend things are different than they seem. What is going on? What am I doing? Questions like these must have been among my first conscious thoughts. If I tried to speak them to anyone, I'm sure what I heard back were directives to be good, work hard, smile, and don't get caught. If others didn't share my horror, or at least consternation, I couldn't understand why not, because we were all subject to the same capricious laws of existence. the same evidence for irrational forces. If they did share it, I was amazed and repulsed by their willingness nonetheless to fritter away their lives acquiring things, planning parties, cleaning up, and checking the news. Countless people have grappled with feelings of emptiness and despair. But I didn't know that then, and other than a few curious pieces of fiction or poetry, I don't recall a single acknowledgement of bewilderment in those around me until I was well into my teens. My first time getting drunk seemed to offer an easy way through the difficulty of growing up, and it was a long while before I had enough awareness to look back and wonder about the causes of my trajectory. In the end, the very effect I loved so much about alcohol, its ability to mute existential fears, utterly betrayed me. It didn't take all that long before the drug's most reliable effect was to ensure the alienation, despair, and emptiness that I sought to medicate. The chief of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, George Koob, has said that there are two ways of becoming an alcoholic, either being born one or drinking a lot. Dr. Koob is not trying to be flip, and the high likelihood that one or the other of these applies to each of us helps explain why the disease is so prevalent. I agree that many who end up like me have a predisposition even before their first sip, but also appreciate that enough exposure to any mind-altering drug will induce tolerance and dependence, hallmarks of addiction, in anyone with a nervous system. Unfortunately, though, no scientific model can yet explain my quick and brutal slide to homelessness, hopelessness, and utter desolation. Choosing oblivion, the next 10 years were characterized by a simple philosophy and practice. I sought any opportunity to use mind-altering drugs and paid any cost. My actions only made sense in terms of that guiding principle. Virtually every moment was shaped by an orientation toward escaping sober awareness. If my first good drink gave me a sense of peace, the first time I got high was plain fun. Alcohol made life bearable, but weed made it hilarious. And coke made it hot, and meth, exciting, and acid, interesting. For all this pharmacological conjuring, I traded myself away a piece at a time. Many of the experiences I had during this formative time are completely lost to memory. But of those I can recall, some were amusing or fantastic. Like the evening just before final exams when I initiated a road trip from St. Louis to Nashville. Others were embarrassing or dangerous, like navigating my grandparents' Suburban with my head out the window because the streetlights seemed so much more informative than the dash or road signage, while several friends clung to the roof, all of us tripping, or climbing into a stranger's speedboat in Miami because I was bored with my date. But the majority are painful. I ended up attending college at a Jesuit school in the heartland, despite fancying myself at a state school in California, because my mother filled out my college applications. Though I had some excellent teachers and did okay my first semester, it didn't take long to find my kind. By early in my second term, I had a fake ID and knew where to score pot, able to pick up right where I left off after graduating from high school high as a kite in South Florida. I'm sure I'm not the only person for whom college was an opportunity to get out from under a watchful parental glare. And the freedom to do what I wanted was exhilarating. I spent most of my time drinking and partying and only studied or went to class as a last resort. Where did all this freedom lead? I have a clear memory of lying in my bunk one afternoon, stoned but despairing. Students were chatting as they walked outside my window or down the hall. I had assignments due or overdue and probably plans to meet up with friends for dinner. However, I was overwhelmed by a sense of emptiness and futility even more intense than usual. I can't think of anything in my circumstances that precipitated this crisis. Even now I think of my drug use, especially in the early stages, as much cure as cause. But for whatever reason, I saw my whole life, despite blips of disaster and achievement, as an aimless trajectory of self-preservation and promotion, starting and going nowhere, and characterized by reflexive and blind occupation. Moreover, it seemed that my life was no different from anyone else's. We were like fish schooling in circles, oblivious to the water and indifferent to anything outside our own self-serving heads. I remember the gray and formless pit in my chest and belly that these thoughts evoked. Each of us was completely alone, and our efforts were primarily directed at maintaining delusions that kept us sane, until we died. The only rational response, I thought, was to kill myself. But the aesthetic of the whole thing struck me as pathetic. Despite thinking all was vanity, I was still quite vain, and leaping from my dorm window just didn't feel like my style. Instead, that afternoon represented a turning point in my addiction. An avid user from the start, I now was truly committed. My behavior became reckless and spiraled quickly toward a life that matched my ideas of existence in terms of heartless insanity. In other words, my response to being overwhelmed by the deep void was to leap into it. I traipsed back from bars in East St. Louis, alone, drunk and stoned, in the early hours of the morning. Several weeks were spent in a housing project with a group of locals I had nothing in common with except an appreciation for freebase cocaine. while their women and children hung out in a windowless bedroom watching TV. I'd end up in an assortment of sordid places completely unprepared and thought testing my wit against whoever or whatever happened to be in my face was a somewhat less tedious way to pass the time as I entertained death. The school decided I should take a break at the same time my parents realized they were being taken. I remember the day, standing in our driveway, when they announced they were withdrawing financial support. I wish I could say I felt sorry, especially as my little brother, a brawny high school football player, bawled in the street, but in fact all I remember is exhilaration. No more limits, no more having to please and satisfy authority. A girlfriend who in important ways was like a twin picked me up, and we checked into a Howard Johnson's after pooling our money to buy a blender, juice, and 2 gallons of vodka. My first taste of adulthood was off to a fine start. For the next 3 years or so, I lived and worked here and there, often scraping by on nothing but lies and evasion. The only constant was using, whether with or without a job, a home, or other conventional resources. I always managed to find a way to get loaded. Before being fired for skimming the till, I worked at a classless bar on the railroad tracks called Tip's Tavern. Regulars arrived with their paychecks on Friday afternoon to pay off their tabs and were usually starting new ones before the end of the night. My parents really detached, and I rarely saw family. I vaguely remember a grandparent's funeral where I was wasted on Quaaludes and struggled to contrive an appropriate countenance while I felt absolutely nothing. It was much later, after some time substance-free, that I was able to mourn anything, including the loss of my grandfather. Another time I was mid-inhale on a fat roach, holding it to my mouth at a stoplight. When I looked to my left and saw both my parents, their hands frozen in a wave. I remember the bright day, and the joy turned sadness in their faces as all 3 of us looked away quickly. I might have thought how unlikely it was that we all happened to be at the same intersection, but actually it wasn't that big of a town. And the truth is, I never got in a car without at least a joint and a couple of beers or a mixed drink. I was flooded in shame for just a bit longer than it took me to alter my course and take another hit. Today I look back on my compulsive self with as much compassion as I feel for my parents. Until about 10 seconds before the first time I used a needle, I thought I'd never inject drugs. Like most people, I associated needles with hardcore use. That is, until I was offered a shot. I remember feeling for an instant before acquiescing as if I really could choose. I didn't recognize crossing this line as inevitable, as it would be the second through NTH time, but rather felt as if I would just like to try it. I tasted and heard the coke before I felt it. An unusual tang on the back of my tongue coupled by ringing in my ears like a fire alarm. Then I felt it, a warm wash of euphoria that was so much richer than that from snorting as my body and brain grew warm and wet and interested, and I felt gratitude for the brilliance of living. I'm not exaggerating when I say that a few minutes later I was in charge of the point. In part so I could be sure my turn wasn't skipped. Still more than a long year away, administering cocaine in this way precipitated my early bottom. Though I ripped off stores and stole credit cards when the opportunity presented itself, I was still able to maintain, at least to myself, that I was basically a good person. To an extent, for instance, I could count on my companions, and they could count on me. I say to an extent, because we also knew and expected that we would lie, cheat, or steal from each other if something really important were at stake. For instance, when we'd pool our money to score, it was best if we all went to the pickup together. On occasions where just one, or a subset, would go, it was pretty much understood that the bag would be a little lighter by the time it arrived. No one should be expected to be that trustworthy. However, I remember one incident when a boyfriend and I planned to go to a neighboring town to watch 4th of July fireworks. Some guy we knew, an acquaintance from work maybe, didn't have plans, and so we invited him along. At the time, I felt generous because he was all alone and a little bit sad, and we were nice enough to let him share our evening. We drank and smoked our way through the festivities, and the next day I found a wad of bills in the back of the car, $300. My boyfriend and I discussed it and decided to keep the money. I knew this was unethical, even by my lax standards, in part because it was so hard to justify. Something about how we'd helped him out and needed to pay our rent. Later, when he asked, I looked the unsuspecting friend right in his eyes and said, "No. I haven't seen it. Bum luck." I knew he needed the cash and that what I had done and said was simply wrong. We ended up buying an 8-ball with the money. Another story, Johnny was a Vietnam vet who lived next door in a crappy apartment behind the high school. A gentle and hopeless guy, he was lonely enough to share his drugs. Johnny's life dream was to be maintained in a hospital bed with a permanent line for IV drug infusions. Under different circumstances, he might have been a friend, but friendship depends on trust and supporting each other's well-being. One day we were slamming coke in his filthy room, when his eyes rolled back and he fell down convulsing. I stepped out of the way and thought, he probably won't want his next bump. He didn't die that day, but of the 3 of us in the room I'm the only one still alive. I share these stories not to make readers uncomfortable or solely to qualify myself as a bona fide addict. My primary purpose in exposing my story is to illustrate the depths, as well as the breadth, of the addictive experience. I don't think I was basically a good person who got mixed up with a bad crowd, for instance, or that I was somehow dealt a crummy hand in terms of genes or neurochemistry, parents, or personal history. I also don't think that I am essentially worse than or even different from others. Not those spending down their allotment of days under bridges, or in prisons, or for that matter managing PTAS or running for public office. All of us face countless choices, and there is no bright line separating good and bad, order and entropy, life and death. Perhaps as a result of following rules or conventions, some live under the delusion that they are innocent, safe, or deserving of their status as well-fed citizens. But if there is a devil, it lives inside each of us. One of my greatest assets is knowing that my primary enemy is not outside me, and for this I am grateful to all my experiences. We all have the capacity for wrong, otherwise we could not, in fact, be free. The opposite of addiction, I have learned, is not sobriety but choice. For many like me, drugs act as potent tools that obscure freedom. But there are countless ways any of us might jump the rail, unwrapping familiar cloaks of vocation, family, or other disguise. As James Baldwin put it, freedom is hard to bear. For those who don't recognize the tenuousness of the situation, just pray that habits, bank accounts, or other props remain securely in place. Bearing change, they say that every recovery is birthed at the bottom. For my part, it's a miracle I didn't get what I deserved, and being sure of this is much better than thinking I deserve more than I've gotten. The start of the end was kicked off behind that unremarkable restaurant on Route 1, where the dealer handed over the wrong bag and my friend offered his surprising insight that there would simply never be enough cocaine. This must have struck a deep chord, because the echo of Steve's words has been rolling like a marble down a culvert ever since. Lines connecting dots are hazy, but that jag constituted my last big coke binge. As a result, in addition to just barely escaping the AIDS virus, I was able to get a little ahead financially and ended up pooling resources with a couple of friends to pay first and last on a one-bedroom apartment. This provided some advantages to living under bridges or piers, including having privacy to hide piles of empties and other evidence of debauchery. The apartment also had a fridge, usually with electricity, facilitating an easier and more effective way to keep beer cold, and hence a switch from 40 seconds to cases. Finally, of course, there was a bathroom, the propitious site for the bottom of my bottom. Though not much for primping, one day just after getting up, I had a terrifying encounter with myself. About 3 inches from the mirror, I was peering into my own eyes and was met with a clear vision of the bottomless abyss inside me. I felt as though I were looking into my own soul, and what I confronted was worse than the emptiness I'd been running from, much worse. My response, naturally, was to head straight for the bong, but still I couldn't shake the creeped-out feeling that day, or for a long while after. I felt haunted by a truth so lorn it made my strategies for evasion look like decorations at the gallows. I think of the moment in the mirror as my bottom because it was probably the closest I'd come to seeing myself in many years. And though what I saw might not have been all of me, it was enough to destroy many of my illusions. For the following 3 or so months, I was incapable of consuming enough of anything to blot out that image. The dam was finally breached during a visit with my father. I was surprised when he offered to take me to dinner for my 23rd birthday, because we hadn't spoken in years. Family ties are deep, though, and below all of my self-righteous anger, I still wanted his love and approval. So when he made the offer, I readily accepted. The day we were to go out, my main concern was to manage my dosing so as to shelter my interactions with him and still remain upright. This was a legitimate worry. By this time, I had almost no relationships that involved expectations, and I knew it was impossible to sleep anything off before an early bird dinner, especially because I woke most days after noon. I literally had no idea what to do with 4 to 5 hours of free time if I wasn't getting wasted. At any rate, I was only a bit toasty when I climbed into his car, and vainly hoping not obviously so. We arrived at the restaurant, which had been my choice. A tiny sushi place with a few small tables and the requisite bar. A few minutes later, I didn't feel particularly vulnerable and also wasn't expecting much. So I was completely caught off guard when my father strangely announced that he just wanted me to be happy. This may possibly be the very last thing I expected to hear. He might have wished me to go back to school, sit up straight, repay what I owed, or take better care of my teeth. But be happy, where did this father come from? But my dad saying he wished me to be happy somehow collapsed my defenses, and I was suddenly blubbering into my miso about how incredibly miserable I was. Despite arranging things to my own liking, by eliminating limits and responsibilities and partying nonstop, I was entirely discontented, so much so that despite extensive experience flaunting bravado, I couldn't muster even a modicum of my usual arrogance as he, along with the other patrons, the waitstaff, and probably even the cook, witnessed my sloppy undoing. When I first arrived for treatment, I lacked both understanding and acceptance. I had no idea what I'd signed on for, just jumped at the chance for escape. As always, adulthood is characterized more than anything else by a capacity to see beyond one's own narrow perspective. And an intake evaluation by the treatment center suggested I'd be best suited for the children's program. I have no doubt they were right on. It was fortunate my parents brought me all the way to Minnesota. If I'd been anywhere near anything or anyone I knew, I'd surely have gone AWOL rather than face the many ways I'd been colluding in my own ruin. Instead, I stayed at the treatment center for 28 days and then spent 3 months in a women's halfway house, aptly named Progress Valley. Talk about a stark introduction to reality. This was a former convent on the side of an interstate filled with infantile brats like me, with rules concerning everything from naps to tea saucers. However, it was there that I began to realize that my initial intuitions about alcohol and other drugs were precisely upside down. Rather than provide a solution to my problems with living, they had chipped away at every prospect until only the barest shred of life remained. I'd sought wellness and became sick, fun, but lived in a constant state of anxious dread, freedom, and was enslaved. In just 10 years, my sources for solace had totally betrayed me, carving out a canyon deep and unlivable. Drugs were destroying every aspect of my life. Yet my days revolved around self-administering until I passed out. By the time I turned 23, it had been years since I'd gone even 24 hours without a drink, pill, fix, or joint. Though the fun and excitement were long gone, I also could not wrap my head around having a disease that necessitated a lifetime of abstinence. I know now that the drugs were still dispensing a mite of escape, and therefore offered a more appealing option than exposing myself raw and unmedicated to the elements of living. But dying slowly a day at a time was turning out to be unbearably painful. I'd finally reached the dead end where I felt I was incapable of living either with or without mind-altering substances. This bleak situation describes the condition of many, if not all, addicts and illustrates why relatively few recover. Despite being depleted, they think the cost of abstinence seems much too high. Without drugs, what is there to live for anyway? Eventually, 2 factors motivated my desire to recover. First, I began to wonder just a wee bit about what it would be like to live in the relatively uncharted territory of sobriety. I'd been scraping around the basement floor for so long it seemed as if it might at least be interesting to explore another place. I thought of myself as courageous, and it was equal parts courage and curiosity that contributed to the decision to give abstinence a try. I promised myself that if I wasn't less miserable sober than I'd been loaded, I'd go back to using, because I had some notion that such a change in lifestyle would suck for a while. My plan included a specific date for reassessment. In true form, I made sure of a back door. My second motivation was a decision to find a cure. The arrogance of this astounds me now, but I also think that some of the traits that facilitated my addiction have helped to make me a good scientist. Bottomless curiosity, a willingness to take risks, and perseverance that make a bulldog seem laid back have all contributed to the successes I've had as a neuroscientist. More than anything else, seeking and acquiring knowledge about drugs, addiction, and the brain have given me compassion for the desperate plight of people like me. The understanding I've gained has helped me stay clean by informing better choices. My hope is that by illuminating the seeming insanity of colluding in habits that are not only joyless but lethal, this book will contribute to a path of freedom for others. Chapter 1: Brain Food. Never does nature say one thing and wisdom another. Juvenal. Why, if I wanted to cure addiction, did I set out to become a neuroscientist, rather than a medical doctor, psychotherapist, or even a self-help guru? Like many others at the time, I believed that the few pounds of fatty goop inside my skull were ultimately responsible for the totality of my condition. Medical and social interventions, if they worked at all, would have to do so via their influence on brain functioning. Therefore, it seemed most straightforward and efficient to focus my efforts on understanding the neural mechanisms behind the states that seemed to define my experience, such as impulsivity and craving. I thought that if I could find the cellular switch that flipped somewhere between my third and my fourth drinks, or each time a promising bag was in my sight, and then find a way to keep this switch in the off position, I might be able to refrain from telling off the few people with whom I was still on speaking terms, or spending all my tips on very temporary thrills, or making blacked-out road trips to Dallas. In other words, I'd be able to use like a lady. The idea that I am my brain still guides the efforts of thousands of neuroscientists around the world as we work to connect experience to neural structures, chemical interactions, and genes. Though plausible, I should mention that an elegant hypothesis is no substitute for definitive data. As time has passed, We have learned that everything from the bacteria in our guts to the interactions we had in middle school partly determines our behavior. In fact, it's beginning to seem that the brain is more like a stage for our life to be acted out upon than like the director behind a curtain calling shots. Nonetheless, it's reasonable to assume that all of our thoughts, feelings, intentions, and behaviors at least have correlates in electrical and chemical signals in the brain, because there's not a whit of evidence to suggest otherwise. Though the central nervous system, that is, the brain and the spinal cord, is mind-bogglingly complex, it is not oversimplifying to say that its cells are continuously occupied with two principal tasks: responding to the environment and then adapting to it. These two basic functions are key to understanding how drugs work and how addiction develops. We'll spend this chapter covering how drugs produce their effects in the brain and the next one on how the brain adapts to those influences and, in doing so, creates addiction. The CNS is our sole means of interacting with the environment. Most neural real estate is employed in sensing, perceiving, and reacting to what is around us. Many good thinkers, from philosophers to novelists, have speculated about who we would be without access to the environment. Aren't our intentions, feelings, and activities all stimulus-driven, at least to some extent? The classic anti-war novel Johnny Got His Gun 1 raises questions about what life would be like if we were unable to sense or respond to the world around us. After nearly being killed in battle, the protagonist wakes in a hospital bed, only to realize that his limbs and face are gone and that he cannot move, speak, see, hear, or smell. The story takes place over several years as Joe grapples with profound limitations. Wondering, for instance, how to tell waking from sleeping in the absence of interactions with the environment. Though Joe's plight is surely the stuff of nightmares, it's not as though any of us accurately experiences what is around us. Far from it. For instance, many insects can see ultraviolet light that for us is, literally, invisible. Similarly, we cannot detect vibrations in air molecules of very high or low frequency, which means we can't hear very high or low-pitched sounds, even though they too are all around us. And while we may see better than dogs, who happen to smell about 1,000 times better than we do, a typical pigeon has much better eyesight than humans do. So, we are all prisoners of our nervous system to some extent. Even within a species, there are differences in sensitivity, and a single individual may demonstrate significant variation across his or her lifetime. For instance, women can typically detect higher-pitched sounds than men, but we all become less sensitive to these as we age. And the vast majority of us are trichromats, meaning that we perceive thousands of different colors by the combined activity in just 3 types of color-sensitive neurons. But some lucky individuals have a mutation that gives them a 4th type of color sensor. And even though they may not be aware of their mutant gift, they are more likely to have careers as artists or designers. The most important lesson here, though, is that our senses constrain our experience by offering us a relatively thin slice of what's out there, a highly filtered version of our environment. Part of the CNS's genius is its ability to convert environmental signals into its native vocabulary of electrical, chemical energy. To say that all abused drugs are sensed by the nervous system is to say that they all reliably alter this electrical and chemical brain activity, just as a pebble tossed into a pond produces discernible ripples. When I was just beginning my experimental drug use as a teen, there was a popular TV public service announcement with the refrain, "This is your brain on drugs," showing an egg dropped into a frying pan, where it sizzled and cooked, implying that drugs were like embalming fluid for the brain. Although it might have captured attention, the argument was entirely vacuous, and even a 9th grader's level of critical thinking skills could see right through it. Every single thing we experience, including drugs certainly, but also propaganda, walks in the woods, lunch with friends, falling in love, making or not making the point, sale, grade, is registered as structural and functional changes on the frying pan of our brain, which is precisely why they are experiences. Here's your brain on skiing, on daydreaming, on anger, on fear. The brain is no more static than a river as currents constantly form from the flow of our experience. In this way, and in others, we are shaped by our environment. So, in order for us to experience anything at all, our nervous system must be altered by the experience. This reality of constant change spawns a paradox, which is that those changes can only be perceived against a background of neural stability, because we encounter an ever-variable environment as we go about our day. If our neural activity simply reflected all of this input, like the ocean in the midst of a storm, then the tossed pebble, or even a boulder, could have no perceptible impact. In neuroparlance, the ratio of signal to noise would be too low. In order for a stimulus to be detected, let alone interpreted as meaningful, the neural signal must be greater than the background noise, or the noise must be quashed. The fundamental role of the brain is to be a contrast detector. As experiences are distinguished from monotony, They spark neurochemical changes in specific brain circuits, informing us of all we care to know: opportunities for food, drink, or sex, danger or pain, beauty and pleasure. For example, the process of actively maintaining the stable baseline critical for conducting the brain's business of contrast detection is called homeostasis. And it depends on having a set point, a comparator, and a mechanism for adjustment. It is easy to appreciate this principle in terms of body temperature, which is maintained around 99 degrees Fahrenheit. If you become much warmer or colder than this, your body feels it, and there are mechanisms to return you to baseline, such as sweating or shivering. Feelings are also constrained within tight bounds under normal conditions. What we generally experience is our personal neutral okayness. Otherwise, we'd be incapable of detecting good or bad events. We'll return to homeostasis later. For now, we'll consider what makes abused drugs remarkable: their ability to hijack the contrast detector for pleasure.